This is a very special version of the YouTube channel today. I'm going to interview Dr. Scott Dunaway, who will actually speak about why knee rehab can go beyond just usage of bands, which I know a lot of people and patients think that bands are the stopping point. They're not. Now, we're going to talk about how we progress through bands and get to the point where we actually don't use bands, where we're using the ground as a feedback tool, how we're rooting of the feet, how we can increase hip motion and stabilization of the torso to improve how your knee works in real life and athletic movements. So Dr. Scott Dunaway is a chiropractor who practices in Nashville and Clarksville, Tennessee currently. You can find him at chirostrength.com. Here we go. Stay tuned. Okay, everyone, I have an interview on with Dr. Scott Dunaway. Hey, how's it going?
It's going good, Doc. How you doing?
Excellent. Thanks for joining. I know you're going to... Where are you going again? You're going to St. Louis?
I have a wedding to go to, in St. Louis, Missouri. So that's about a 5-hour trek north of Nashville because we're stopping off at the parents' house and drop off the dogs.
Oh, yeah? Yeah. I never realized... So is actually St. Louis in... There's another St. Louis, right? There's an East and West St. Louis.
Yeah. So St. Louis City, like St. Louis is in Missouri, and it's just right on the border of Illinois. So there's when you go over into East St. Louis, you're in a very different city.
That's what I think. But there's that riverboat casino that is like that is on the other.
Technically in Illinois, yeah.
Okay, that's the Illinois side. I remember when we crossed over, I thought like this is I feel like I'm in a desolate area now. All of a sudden, I thought this was St. Louis.
Well, I'm from Cape Girardeau, Missouri. We have that same kind of thing. We're right on the Mississippi right there. So you have Cape Girardeau, you have East Cape Girardeau, and pretty much what happens in East Cape Girardeau, East St. Louis is again a very different atmosphere than what it happens actually in the city. But it's a cool city. It's really cool. Yeah, I went to chiropractic school in St. Louis, so that's where I spent 2009 to 2012. So Cardinals won the World Series at that point. So it was awesome to be in that environment up there.
So you're a Cards fan now. What team is close to actually Tennessee or Nashville? Is there?
There's not a lot of. We have a AAA team here. I think it used to be the Brewers AAA. Now it's the A's AAA. But as far as teams, people are either Cardinals fans, Braves fans, or Cubs fans. You got that kind of. It's in the middle of Atlanta and St. Louis and Chicago.
Mm-hmm. A lot of National League. Actually, the Cards are National League.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
Whole lot of National League.
So the reason I wanted to have you on today was because we were talking about knee rehab specifically. I know we can take this many different ways, so don't be afraid to go to different joints. But we were talking about kind of going beyond the bands as in regards to rehab because you got a lot of good stuff on Instagram.
Appreciate that.
Yeah. So I will put a link to that, by the way. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself, but also let everyone know kind of how you started to practice a little bit beyond the band?
Awesome. Yeah. So my practice was kind of just formed by me learning lessons the hard way because I went through chiropractic school really interested in just in general how the body works and more specifically kind of why it breaks. And so I took a different approach than just the skeleton. So general chiropractically speaking, we had took a lot of x-rays of the spine and then from the standpoint of doing adjustments to the spine, I was never really in that model. I was full body certified in active release techniques before I ever graduated chiropractic school. So I was always doing a lot of soft tissue work as opposed to just the adjusting. And then just by doing more soft tissue work, more shoulders and knees and stuff like that tend to come into play that traditional chiropractic doesn't treat as thoroughly. And so based on the need to do that, I just kind of started going down the rabbit hole of corrective exercise, and whether it was through Gray Cook or whether it was through Perry Nicholson or through some other kind of active therapy style practitioners, whether it's PT, chiropractic, strength conditioning coaches, it kind of molded into what ChiroStrength was well before I opened ChiroStrength. And so I spent first 3 years of my practice in traditional chiropractic practice as an independent contractor, trying to shove that square peg into this round hole and it just never worked. So under the same billing scheme as they were doing, I was doing 20, 30-minute visits as the guy was doing 4 visits in 20 minutes. And so I learned lessons the hard way. So it took me about 6 months to realize that wasn't going to work. But then I kind of worked through my contract to just get a little guidance, because from a business standpoint, he was a good mentor to have. So I think in 2016, January 2016, I had a grand opening ChiroStrength. So I kind of developed a model that wasn't around me at the time, developed a model that I could practice like that in an environment that would allow me to mesh that soft tissue work with chiropractic and corrective exercise. So that's kind of how it came to be.
So when you started your own, is it because you saw that there was a void of people practicing this way and treating patients this way, or is it that you wanted to kind of venture out on your own?
It was a little bit of both. So anytime I do something or don't do something, it's always about what feels most right to me. So whether I can comprehend something that you're saying. So that's why I don't do acupuncture. I know acupuncture is very, very beneficial, and I get that it's been around for a long time. But in my head, I can't connect those dots between energy, meridians, and stuff like that. It just doesn't make sense. So I have friends and coworkers that do acupuncture that I can send them to, so I don't try to explain that to people. It was easy for me to explain the biomechanical model of why I need you to have glute engagement for your knee to be better, or good foot stability for your knee to be better. I can make those connect those dots. And whether it was learning those corrective exercise or learning underneath that umbrella, it made a lot of sense. So when I opened ChiroStrength, my desire was to have much more of an active clinic, much more kind of bridging the gap between fitness, which I think is like the true medicine, fitness and passive therapy. And so for getting somebody off the table and under a barbell, it was kind of there's a big void there for most people. And so that active therapy style was what I really wanted to do, because I found myself not liking to lecture, but liking to teach and kind of educate people and see that light bulb go off, like, yeah, that does make sense. Yeah. Instead of the vertebra's twisted like this, so I'm going to do this, and then you're going to feel better. It's like there's a lot of steps that they don't really understand, but patients usually will say, I'll take your word for it, but I don't want them to take my word for it. I want them to understand that. And so I could explain that model, and it wasn't available to me at the time, so I couldn't go in underneath with somebody. So just kind of blindly just went through that whole process, and here we are today.
I get to see you on day one. Probably you're like, okay, like I have to create all my own systems, and I have to be able to, like, how am I going to explain this to this person, you know? And
it was so not terrifying, because ignorance is bliss, and you're like, I just got to figure out how am I going to get their money, and how am I going to schedule them, and how am I going to contact them, not from my cell phone. And once I figured that out, it was like, okay, so I have a business line, I have an email, I have a website, I have a way to collect money. All right, let's do it. Yeah. And it's been a lot of things I would have done differently if I were to do this again. But I mean, like I said before, I don't learn very quickly, so I learn by mistakes, and it's turned out well so far.
It's funny. I think we've had the same. Like I laugh because like all the stuff you're saying, I'm thinking that was the exact thing that I did too. And even like your thought process of going from passive therapies to active is like what like my vision was. But one of the big things I did wrong early on was I used my cell phone number as the office number. And then people still get a hold of that, and I don't know about you, but I don't want to sound like an ass, but I'm like, don't call my cell. It's not because I don't want to talk to you, but it's because you're driving all of a sudden. You can't schedule them. You're right. I mean, it's just
I've done that before too. It's like you're sitting there, you're having a conversation, and all of a sudden you're like, all right, I'll put you on the schedule, and then obviously something else happens, and they walk into your office, and you're like,
this is completely my fault.
So here's what's going to happen.
Well, I saw you. So now you're kind of moving towards. You said you're doing a lot of educational parts. I see that you're doing more of like an e-medicine, you call it. Can you explain why you went that way? I know we haven't jumped into knees yet, but let's just say like someone with a knee injury, what do you think they can learn from something like electronic medicine?
So it's a really cool idea, and so you got to get out of the mindset of the medical model when you're talking about kind of the education because I don't use words like plantar fasciitis or meniscus tear or AC. When you're talking about e-medicine from a standpoint of what I do, it's all about, all right, here's how the knee, for example, here's what the knee's responsibilities are, and here's how it can perform those correctly. And so based on that, if it's not performing correctly, we got to figure out what joint isn't doing what it should be doing. So instead of going about it from a standpoint of diagnosing an injury, they can take care of a lot of. So let's kind of back up a second. Let's say I wake up one morning and I'm going down the stairs. All of a sudden I have a terrible knee pain. Mm-hmm. No traumatic accident, nothing like that. It just kind of I don't know where it came from. Same thing can be said for a back issue or a neck issue or anything like that. When you go into a doctor, or whether that's a PT, a chiropractor, a medical doctor, you have zero idea of what's going on. All you know is you have pain. And so where I see this E model coming in is whether it's a PDF, or you go through an E class, or you do a consult with somebody that can help you. At least what you can do is you can take care of a lot of the low-hanging fruit. So you can understand how the hip and the foot affect the knee. And you can kind of self-assess and go through some movements and see, well, yeah, my big toe extension really is limited. And so unless you're in significant pain and you have to go in because you can't move, if that's the case, you probably don't need to be doing eHealth. But if it's just an annoying thing that's been around for a long time, you can take care of a lot of the low-hanging fruit from a mobility, stability, movement standpoint. So then whatever's left over when all that dust settles, you can go into your doc now and say, okay, here's what I felt 3 weeks ago, and here's what I've done to this point, and here's what's still lasting, and here's what helps, and here's what doesn't help. And you can start to learn how to communicate with the doc on a better level, as opposed to just saying my knee hurts and just wherever that goes, it goes. So from a doc standpoint, when a patient comes in, and this can kind of be a double-edged sword, because when you say an educated patient, oftentimes the education they have is completely off base. But if they come in with an understanding of I've cleared these symptoms by doing this, and this seems to be helping, and this seems to be hurting, it makes treatment for that doc that's going to put their hands on them a lot easier, because there's a lot less variables involved now. And now they can just really attack the problems that are kind of left over.
Well, so then how do you get people to learn about, let's use that in the analogy of walking down the stairs. How long does it get that? How long do you feel like it takes them to fully understand the reasons why this could happen? At least we're talking about overuse or recurring types of injuries.
That's how long it could be.
I'm sure that's your struggle over there, right?
It is. So for people that have good movement literacy and body awareness, they can get it right away. Because if I have them go through a squat and I say, I want you to take this squat, I want to take you 10 seconds to get to the bottom of this squat. And I watch them do that, and they're very knee dominant. They can feel that in their knees. And I just kind of tell them, be aware of where you're feeling this when you do this. And then if I can just tell somebody to kind of push their hip backs and engage their core, and in their body, they can internalize that cue and actually make it happen, which is not everybody. They can really start to feel the difference of shifting weight from their knees into their hips and appreciate the fact that I'm still able to do this movement and I still feel pretty good, but now I'm not feeling my knees, I'm feeling my hips. And that's just a real simple concept for them to be like, oh, if I can load this area, it's going to take stress off this area. And that will apply to low back, neck, shoulder, everything. Mm-hmm. And so there are people, whether you call it a coordination issue or anything like that, there's just, they can't take a drink and walk at the same time. They just aren't very,
teenagers.
Yes. And so you try to get them to do what I just described, and it's just kind of foreign to them, and they can't internalize that, and they hear what I'm saying, but they end up not being able to go through the movements that I'm describing. So if they have that good movement literacy, which it just takes practice. It's almost like taking somebody that has naturally good mobility as an athlete and you try to put them over a golf ball. It might look really awkward at first, but if they have the ability to get in the right positions, they can learn to swing pretty quickly. And it might not be great, but at least they can perform the movements. But then you get people that are just real stiff and not very fluid with their movement. And that right there has to be taken care of, because that's a skill. And that's why I always talk about movement's a skill, stretching is a skill, strength is a skill. And it's all about being able to understand how to get in the right positions and load those tissues properly. So it really depends on the person, and not everybody, and nothing works for everybody. So a lot of people aren't able to it takes them a lot longer to kind of grasp that idea. And you might have to go through A through Z worth of, well, try this and then try this and try this. And eventually it's going to click with somebody depending on how they're internalizing those cues. And so that's why it helps to kind of have a couple backup plans and a few more tools in the toolbox to kind of work with them with that.
So you said something there, you talked about position and then load. So can you explain in the knee model why position is first and then load?
From a standpoint of just movement in general, or as far as the kind of a static structure of the joints?
Well, because I know a lot of people, let's just say we're talking about squatting or walking downstairs. Like it's,
okay.
Let's just say squatting is the easiest thing.
Yep.
So it hurts to go through full range of motion. You said you can get them to load their hips a little bit more and blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden it doesn't hurt anymore. So that's a positional change, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So then I'm sure there's a lot of people too. They're like, I'm just going to tough this out. I'm just going to go in and I'm going to do squats. I'm going to do step aerobics, whatever it takes. I'm just going to work through it.
Yeah.
So you were saying that then a position is more important than working through it or applying repetition or load, right?
Mm-hmm. So I think where I usually have this conversation, it's more of a conversation of people being told what good form is from a visual standpoint, and not being told what good form feels like. And so there's a difference between that internalizing a cue and just having an external cue of get your butt back and knees wide kind of thing, right? And so when I'm talking about position or something like that, I think most of the poor positions with squats or something, or deadlifts or bench, or just in general breathing, it usually comes from someone hearing a cue that might be a good cue, but interpreting it differently, and how they display that movement once they internalize that cue, it just something there was a missing link because it looks terrible kind of thing. So don't bend from the spine is a cue that you hear with squatting, and keep the spine neutral. Mm-hmm. And what a lot of people will internalize is keep that spine vertical, and a vertical spine and a neutral spine is very different if you're moving from the hips. So if they're trying to keep a neutral spine, they'll try to keep that chest up as long as possible, thinking vertical is neutral. Mm-hmm. And so they'll descend straight down as opposed to sinking back into the hips. And so if you can get them into a good position, that's great. But even if you get people in a good squat position, you get them, if I can just talk people through a good squat position, we line 10 people up on a wall, depending on past injuries and bone structure and their experience with exercise. Someone's going to feel it in their back, someone's going to feel it in their hips, someone's going to feel it in their ankles. I mean, it's going to feel it in a bunch of different spots. So I really try to use that term internal cues a lot, because we can get you in a good position, but then it's in this position, I need you to hold this tension here, and here's kind of how we do that. And we start talking through whatever that position is, whether it's a squat or whether it's a dead bug or whether it's something like that.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I know that you probably have the same experience then, just so everyone listening, is that people respond differently to different cues, although we're trying to do the same thing with them, right? So not everyone's the same. And like you said, everyone they feel things in different places, so everyone's very unique.
And it can be frustrating. And I remember being my first, that first moment that I remember being in practice was actually in the other clinic I was in, and one of the front office staff came up and was kind of trying to go through some stretches with me, and I kind of had her in that kind of 90 and 90, trying to get a good stretch on the posterior hip, and I'm like, all right, now go through here and go through here, and I'm feeling the stretch where I should be feeling it, and she looks a lot like me, and she's like, I feel that in my hamstring, or I feel that it wasn't even a hamstring, it was something like completely opposite. And it had made no sense to me as far as how could you possibly be feeling that. And I realized I was just like, and because it was the office worker, I was just like, Gina, let's stop. I got to figure this out. I don't know what to tell you. Like, this is impossible. Like, let's. And so over time, you just learn, as far as, especially in that position right there, I stopped talking about what the torso looks like. I started talking about what the pelvis looks like from a standpoint of getting a stretch, because getting people in what looks like the same position, you're right, they feel in a bunch of different places, and it doesn't always make sense. And I think, how do you feel a hamstring stretch when your knee is bending? Like, that doesn't make much sense to me. Like, what's going on there?
Well, maybe it's a misinterpretation of, like, maybe she didn't know how to describe her feelings too.
Yes, that ends up being a big thing with a lot of patients too. Yeah. Is that trying to verbalize what they're feeling, and it's always kind of hard, especially if you have an extensive vocabulary to be able to say that.
I have a good story actually. This happened yesterday. So there's this older Vietnamese couple that came in, and they don't speak English, so they bring their daughter or son in as a translator. Yeah. So for the guy, I was having him doing carries, right? And he was very resistant of the carries because I gave him like 20 pounds. He's like, nope. He knew one word. He's like, too heavy. So he put it down, and I gave him a 10. He's like, he didn't fight the 10. So then I wanted him to actually just press the weight into the ground, right? So his daughter translates this whole thing, but I'm in front of him and just kind of showing like, here's where you are, drive it to the ground, right? Because he's shrugging his shoulders. So then what he did was he just kept going like this. And I kept telling the daughter, I'm like, no, press down. This went on for like a minute, and finally he's like, so the point is that I thought I was effective with my cueing, but then through translation or playing telephone, she might not have been effective with her cueing.
Yeah. I mean, you're playing telephone with a single person too, because they hear the words you're saying, and then their brain has to interpret that, and so it's like that message gets lost sometimes. So there's definitely an art to coaching, and that's what comes in as far as figuring out which cue works best. And it gets frustrating. I've been in the office before, and I just had to take a step back and just. I think I'm speaking English. I swear I'm speaking English right now, and I'm pretty sure you speak English. What's going on here? Yeah. And it's just, I think we take for granted sometimes as far as being in this model a whole lot, that when you're new to the model, something like the word hinge or engage or something like that just doesn't make sense.
Yeah. I've been trying to really get people away from saying the word core, because I asked them, I'm like, what is your interpretation? They're like, well, here, and they point to their belly and back sometimes. Yeah. So I've been going with pillar or something of that nature. Yeah. Something that would at least get them anatomically realize we're talking here to here,
Yeah.
So so since going back to knees a little bit, then what would a rough progression, because I know we talked about band-based stuff. And I know a lot of people come into me with they have TheraBands that they've been using for the past 5 years before they broke. So, but they're still on them is the thing. So is there a progression that you have to get into them, use them, and then get out of them?
Well, it's kind of depends. I mean, when we talk about bands, there's a bunch of different kind of bands. You have the bands. When we talk about knee, mostly what you're talking about is the 14-inch bands that go around the ankles or go around the knees, and you see people doing like the monster walks or the lateral shuffle, or you see people doing like the banded clamshells, stuff like that, which is all good. I mean, and at the end of the day, those are essentially just tools to kind of challenge the body enough to respond well, so they can feel if they need to get their glutes firing. And you put a band there, and they don't let those knees cave in. That's they don't have to think about that, and they can just keep that position, and they'll kind of automatically, the body will adapt and start to get into a better position. But what I found is if you taking someone from a rehab model to where they're doing low level stuff with bands, especially those little 14-inch bands, and then you try to have them get into a off balance, like an inline lunge or something like that, that doesn't have a whole lot of carryover. And when we're walking, it doesn't have a whole lot of carryover from a standpoint of being on single leg, and it's a very specific skill. Oh, there you go. My phone just fell over. Sorry, buddy.
I know what chandelier you have.
Yeah, there you go. So the if we talk about the body functioning like a skill, and balance is a good example, and this is why wobble boards and stuff like that kind of overdo their welcome in the context of rehab, because they've done a study before it was a balance study. So whether you're balancing on a Bosu ball, balancing on flat ground, balancing on a balance beam, on a slack line, on one of those whatever you call them, the things that kind of have a single cylinder here, and you kind of try to wobble on it. Those
surfing ones.
Yeah. So, and what they found is if you're good at one of those, it doesn't necessarily make you good at the other one. And so balance is a very specific skill. So that's why for knee rehab, that is on a lot of Bosu balls and stuff like that. And it doesn't really carry over well to that stability being on flat ground and being able to transfer force through that ground where you're nice and stable. So the bands themselves, they do serve a purpose, but I think once you get that internalization, what it feels like to have the glutes active, you can kind of take that out of the equation now and start making things a little more dynamic or skill-based work. And instead of doing monster walks, really challenge yourself with some kind of single leg deadlifts or even being on your side and doing a lot of side plank work and working with your body weight would be a better approach than just trying to now before every single time I squat, I just have bands to warm up, or now every time I have pain, I get on the ground and do banded clamshells. And I think a lot of times there's that disconnect again that we've talked about between rehab and performance, and whatever performance means, whether it's a performance in a sport or performance just in everyday life, whether you have to carry around a newborn baby or whether you have to be uploading crates and stuff like that at work, that those bands, once you get out of that rehab model and you get underneath, you get out of that very basic isolated style of activation, I don't see tons of need for it. Yeah. But then again, the bands that are the 41-inch loop bands that you can pull down and use as kind of a good resistance for pull-off presses or pulls or pushes or presses, or even the thicker bands that allow you to suspend weight and do carries with and stuff like that. There's a lot of use for them, but I think from a standpoint of knee rehab, they're an educational tool at best from a standpoint of the body learning how to hold weight properly or being able to engage certain joints properly. But I think that's pretty much where they should be left.
So you're talking about basically changing the vector of the band.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I totally agree, by the way. And so you spoke about, I guess there's 2 points. So number one, actually, you said ground contact or being able to drive off the ground. Can you explain why that's needed in a knee case?
Yes. So obviously you're only as good as your foundation, right? So we talk a lot. I see a lot of people doing hip stability drills like single leg deadlift or any single leg variations, but there's no balance because that foot it doesn't have good communication with the brain. So taking a step back and having that proprioception conversation. Essentially, that foot and ankle has 33 joints, and each one of those joints kind of speak to the brain as far as here's how much weight's here, and kind of here's where that weight is traveling through this joint. And then when all those joints are communicating properly, the brain can the brain and body can make modifications or shifts in weight to keep you balanced. And when that foot is either locked down and doesn't move very well, or there's past injuries and there's a dampening of that signal or that proprioception back to the brain, now we're talking about a foundation that has these gross overcorrections. So you have someone do a single leg stance balance and they're sitting here and their whole body's twitching like this, they're flinging their arms up, and they can't just stand on one leg and make those minor little corrections. And so when that is the case, a lot of times what you'll see is people, when they, for example, do a calf raise, they don't have good ground contact, and they'll always roll over to the outside of the foot because the rest of the foot's not used to engaging and keeping that ankle stable. So as you come up, there's kind of a pocket of stability that you can just kind of hang out in without having to stabilize an ankle very much. And what that is, it's kind of that ankle inverts a little bit and just kind of sets on ligaments. And that ligamentous end range is where you kind of just set. And you'll see people where the heels are much wider than the actual toes, and they're actually not even on their big toe knuckles at all, and they're all on the outside of their foot. And that usually carries over to gait. And so if they don't have that ability to be stable through the foot and have good ground contact, whether we're talking about a squat or we're talking about a gait pattern, what they'll end up happening is they're not used to pushing off that toe with good ground contact. So what they'll do is turn their feet to the outside like this, and now as they push off, they're still able to push off this part of the foot, but now they've kind of eliminated the need for it. And so the body will find that path of least resistance. So you will, if you take that kind of gait and that kind of stability into strength training, then you end up really training a compensation, which over time will put a lot of stress through that knee with tibial torsion and stuff like that.
So just to make sure to clarify for people, so
yeah,
it sounds like then, so it's important to train ground contact.
Yes.
And
so a simple cue real quick with that, ground contact. Let's talk about it in the context of a squat.
Okay.
And this is where cueing the knees to be wide is not going to be a good cue, because wide knees, you'll go wide, but you'll kind of roll to the outside of your foot as well. So I got this one from Chris Duffin, who's with Kabuki Strength, and they put on great seminars as far as powerlifting seminars, and they call it rooting. So rooting into the ground. And I'm going to use my hand imagine this if you're listening. And
how about some you do plexiglass?
Take my word
right?
for it.
You can mime it.
Right. So if you think about the big toe knuckle, it's the contact of that joint before you actually can kind of move your toes. So the big toe knuckle and the little toe knuckles are two spots that need to be grounded at all times during a squat or during a single leg deadlift. And then you have your heel. So you have 3 points of contact, and all 3 points of contact need to be rooted into the ground during your movements, so you have a nice, good, strong, stable base. And as soon as you start to roll to the outside of your foot or come up onto your toes or fall back onto your heels, you lose some of that contact, and you can't produce as much force through that kind of minimal contact. So that's what I mean by good ground contact. So I tell people to envision this in their head of having sensors on those areas. And so you want those sensors to all be equally pressed into the ground. So if one starts to come off the ground, think about it like turning red, and then you kind of just try to put it back down. And sometimes having a visual cue to kind of think about that allows them to kind of, and it's funny, then their eyes are open, they're going through this, but you can see they're completely inside their own body, and they're not really worrying about what they look like. So it's really fun to kind of see those cues drive that movement.
Have you used I know back on the band topic have you used bands under those or under the contact points before?
Yeah, I've used bands. Yes. So I'll take a band under a kettlebell and kind of pull it under their big toe if they tend to fall out, or I'll take 2 business cards and I'll just put them underneath the big toe knuckle and little toe knuckle, and I'll try to pull both of them out at the same time. And so just to kind of, it's a fun little game, but bands, that is a good use for a band for sure.
Yeah, that was a good segue into it.
Yeah, exactly. There's plenty of uses for bands. It's just a matter of how you use it.
Well, that's cool. That's I definitely agree with you with the contact and everything. I say tripod foot and then drill it into the ground. But obviously different cues for different things. So you spoke earlier about one of your examples was moving crates, and I just envisioned the rotation of the knee or the rotation of the limb, and I know that I've found, or I've struggled with, getting people to realize why we're training. Like I did have a lady before, we were training basically how to turn, standing turns. And she's like, when are we going to do something for my knee? And I'm like, we're doing something for your knee. so can you give some examples of maybe exercises or rehab stuff that you would do to prep someone for real everyday life, like moving crates? Yeah,
so we talk about specifically moving crates, and you brought up rotation. So let's talk about rotation in general.
Okay.
So if the body's going to move to meet the demands that you're placing on it, right? And so again, it's going to find the path of least resistance. So let's say you have a big block in internal rotation of the hip, right? So you walk with your toes out all the time, and you can't really bring the toes in. And when you bring the toes in, that movement doesn't happen at the hip, but more of that movement happens at the knee. So typically when you have a knee pain or a knee injury, especially with meniscus tears, it's because there's too much motion there, because it's not being shared throughout the rest of the body. And a lot of times that motion can come from the hip. So when I have someone with a knee issue and they have pain walking or turning, or they're pushing off and they have pain with that, I'll talk about doing hip internal external rotation in a hip flexed position and a hip extended position. So one of my favorite hip internal rotation drills, which is really important, and if, for example, and again, we use a couple examples here, if you have a lack of hip motion, obviously that's going to create more torsion at the knee, but you also create a lot of strain in things like the obliques, so that also help move. So the hip being a linchpin there, the internal rotation is often a limited in a lot of people, just like hip extension, especially if you sit. And so one of my favorite drills, if you think about getting on your back and putting your feet against the wall to where their knees are bent to 90 degrees, maybe a little bit more than 90 degrees, because you're going to end up sliding those feet out. And you take either your fists and put them together, and so there's about a 6 to 8 inch gap between your knees, and you just put a little pressure between your fist or a yoga block or a ball. And then what you end up doing is you end up with your feet flat on the wall, and you end up walking those feet out away from each other. So you still keep a little pressure in the block, and so you end up developing this internal rotation at the hip. And because you're on your back, you'll really be able to notice when you run out of internal rotation. And you can appreciate by trying to keep a little pressure into that block, you really feel that in the hip. And that's, you can either do that with your knees bent or slide up all the way to the wall to where your butt's against the wall and the feet are, the heels are pointed towards the ceiling, and you can also try to point those toes in. And a lot of times when you try to do that, what you'll see people do is imagine being on your back, butt against the wall, feet towards the ceiling. You'll see people use their ankles to kind of invert and get that internal rotation as opposed to getting it from the femur. Oh. And so you'll be able to see in real time where people try to get their internal rotation. And where they go to first and how they internalize that cue is typically how they try to get that movement in everyday life. So it is kind of funny to kind of see how they try to get that. So just those drills itself will help with the mobility, but it also just helps them understand what that feels like. And so going through that, especially that hip internal rotation as opposed to the ankle motion, allows them to carry over that feeling of opening that hip up now when they're on their feet. But
do you have a post on that one on your Instagram by chance?
I'm sure I do. I just saw it today. I was there like 711 posts, so I'm sure it's on there somewhere. I know.
How do you categorize those, by the way?
Listen, I don't at all. I don't.
That's the bummer about Instagram.
I know. So what I do is I use it as a brain dump, and that's why I started it. So I had I'll come across these drills, or you essentially every time you get in with a patient, you're freestyling to a certain extent. You have these assessments that you do, but then based on what the provocative factor is or what their demands are outside the clinic, you start kind of freestyling these stretches or these activations or these programs. And so I'll through whatever scenario we have, we end up coming up with these little modifications of an exercise. There's nothing new in rehab. There's nothing new in exercise, but you end up coming up with these little cool modifications. So whenever I would do that, I would normally forget about it because you come up with stuff and you end up forgetting about it. And then so Instagram ended up becoming that brain dump.
Oh, cool.
So I'm sure I do. I know for a fact I have one on YouTube, and I'm sure there's some internal rotation videos. I know I put an active one on, ironically enough, with a band, with one of those loop bands to try to get some good active range of internal rotation and engagement in internal rotation. But typically what I'll tell people to do is whenever you're talking about hip mobility, work on hip mobility with the hip flexed, because that's going to challenge the mobility a different way, but also with that hip extended or with that hip in a neutral position, because a lot of times I see people doing these exercises on the ground, and so there's a lot of hip flexion when you're down on the ground, and then they stand up, and that hip moves very differently when it's stood up in a more neutral position from a standpoint of rotation and from a standpoint of just kind of putting force through the joint in general. So how the knee and hip function when you're kind of in a tactical frog position, if you will, or kind of that quadruped rocking position.
Is that really a tactical frog? Like,
I don't know. I saw the name for that. Gosh, one time, and I just kind of ran with it. I guess I don't know what the tactical portion of that is, but
I can't wait to see the parody video of a tactical frog.
I know, just all done up like in Rambo gear, and just halfway through the stretch, just pulling out a machete. That'd be good.
You know, I heard that actually all you have to do to make a patient better is not hip mobility. You just rub coconut oil on them. Heard coconut oil, and I swear to God,
coconut
like
oil is pretty good for everything.
Coconut oil. If we would have bought coconut oil farms or coconut farms as well as cauliflower farms right now, or like 5 years ago, we'd have been rich by now.
God, so yeah, that's coconut oil it is so that's most of my experience with coconut oil comes from when I always do experimentations, whether it's with diets or workouts or anything like that. And so definitely did some experimentation with coconut oil. And actually coconut oil has been what now I use for my when I'm doing any type of scraping or I need some kind of lubricant. I use a lot of coconut oil for that too.
She does make them better.
It does. But ingesting coconut oil can get a little dicey. And so we've all heard about like the butter and coconut oil, the butter, NTT oil, and the coffee. And so I would do that, and I still do to a certain extent. But I had a bad experience with it. So if you did not know, coconut oil, when ingested in a larger amount, becomes an extreme laxative.
Does it really?
And
I've never had. How many spoonfuls you take?
There was no measurement at all, and if there was a measurement, I probably would have gotten that red flag. It was I took just a teaspoon, and I didn't have any butter that day, so I was like, I'm just going to double up on this coconut oil. So this was on my drive up to Clarksville, and so I had about an hour, so I drank my coffee nice and slow, and I'm getting in there with a patient, and I'm thinking, oh, what's going on? I feel like my stomach is upset. And I start sweating, and I'm sitting there trying to talk to the patient, and I'm a one-man show in my clinic, right? So for right now, I do everything, because it's a very low volume clinic. And so I can't just say, Jamie's going to check you out. Nice seeing you. Goodbye. And I sat there, and I felt it building up and building up and building up. And each one of my treatments are like 20 to 30 minutes. And so I felt it pretty early on. I was like, I'll just ride this out. And by the end of it, it looked like my feet were on fire. I was sitting here just kind of hopping back and forth. I'm like, yep. I got them checked out, ran to the bathroom, and never did coconut oil in my coffee again to that extent.
Really? That's
nope.
Good. That's good.
It was tough.
So with the remainder of your coconut oil, you just cook with it? You don't even?
I do cook with it, and I still put it in there, but I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm only going to do mostly butter and just a little bit of coconut oil now. So it's all about the dosage with that one, which is with a lot of stuff. But yeah, coconut oil. If you ever have an issue just gobble up some coconut oil and don't travel too far away from a bathroom.
I'll do it on my day off.
Yeah.
Funny, actually, I got something in the mail recently from, it was a class action suit against, so I get my coconut oil at Costco, actually, that big tub. So I was reading this thing, and it's a class action against the coconut oil company or whatever it was. I think it was against Kirkland one. So you were entitled to, if you can prove that you bought a tub of coconut oil, you're entitled to about 30 cents per tub, because they said it's not health, or it says healthy on it, and someone made a claim that it's not healthy or something of that nature. Like, it was like false advertising. It was the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen in the world. I'm like, I'm gonna fish through receipts even if I cared. I don't even agree with it anyways, but even if I cared, I wouldn't fish through for 30 cents on a thing. 30 cents. Yeah, it was kind of funny.
People are crazy, but again, McDonald's is getting sued for hot coffee these days. So what are you gonna do?
Yeah, well, that's why they came up with cold coffee all of a sudden.
Yeah. It can be frustrating. Try to navigate that garbage fire.
Yeah. So in rehab, in the whole rehab realm, what are you most excited about in regards to what you're learning now?
There's a couple things that I'm really excited about, and I don't think I know enough to know I don't know enough to have an intelligent conversation for a long time about this. But I'm excited about the reemergence, if you will, of the blood flow restriction training, so the BFR that's going on, and as well as the regeneration modalities, whether it's PRP injections or stem cell and PRP injections, and all this idea of being able to not just put in synthetic stuff in the body, but actually be able to regenerate tissue. And it seems like it's still, for lack of a better word and pardon the pun, in the embryonic stages, but it's really going to be interesting to see where non-surgical interventions are going to come from, as far as repairing tears and repairing all that stuff.
Well, I wonder though, with people that, like, when they have tears, like non-traumatic tears, I hope that they still seek to improve movement.
Oh, for sure. I tell people this all the time. They come in and see me, and oftentimes you're dealing with a tear. I have someone right now that has 2 tears in the rotator cuff and a slight tear in her labrum. And even if you're going to go through surgery, most of the times you're going to have to go through a round of PT anyways. And the area that gets injured is never the area that's the problem. So you put in this brand new part, but it's still in that faulty system. So it's just a matter of time before it's going to break again. And that's why back surgery is so unsuccessful from a standpoint of 5-year outcomes. And they always have to get it redone, because if you don't fix the system that the part is being stressed in, you can get as many parts as you want, and it's going to cost you a whole lot of money, and you're going to end up with terrible advice like don't squat again because your knee's bad. And it's
really your hips or ankles are just bad, or your torso is bad.
yeah. There's a lot of stuff, and it just depends on what. I mean, it can be such, and that's the frustrating thing, because it's so simple on one end, but it's so complicated on the other end. And just kind of understanding that the knee doesn't function in isolation. So why would you surgically or interventionally try to treat it in isolation, whether it's with injections or anything. It just seems like the big game here is insurance, and insurance doesn't cover for us to be able to sit there and give people a corrective exercise program. It doesn't pay for them. It doesn't pay for. I wish insurance would pay for gym memberships and be able to go to a gym membership and maybe up the certification level of people that would be engaging with that person at the gym. But it just seems like, it's hopefully if someone needs to go through surgery, they can appreciate the idea of prehab rather than just the rehab.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think a lot of people need to take it upon themselves to educate themselves with stuff like what you have, and then do the work, and if they happen to get something repaired, it's still you gotta work around it, because the insurance, luckily, at least the insurance, a lot of times it pays for the actual repair, but you don't. I'm sure that you have the same experience, but you don't always need the repair, right? I mean,
no, especially you see the outcomes specifically with discs and meniscus. So knee surgeries for meniscus, those outcomes are awful. As far as repairing a meniscus tear, because we go back to that rotation of the hip and the rotation of the knee. You can't just go and assume that you're going to fix a non-traumatic meniscal tear and everything just be fine. There has to be something that changes, whether it's something you're doing on a daily basis or the system itself that the knee's operating in has to change. But I think that's where insurance has to change before the medical community in general changes. But then for people that want that type of care, they're going to have to pay for it. It is what it is. Just kind of like a gym membership. You have to make that investment early so you don't have to make that investment later, because you're going to make it one way or the other. Yeah,
I totally agree. And I don't know, I've talked with colleagues about this before, and a patient will approach me and they're like, how come you don't take insurance? I mean, I take a couple here and there, but I don't know. Do you take insurance, by the way?
I don't. You can say that, and it's easier. What I will say, it's easier to start off with no insurance as opposed to try to remodel a clinic around a cash model, because it is tough.
Yeah.
And I tell people, I have a couple colleagues, especially those that I graduated with, asking kind of what I'm doing, because everyone wants to implement this kind of stuff into their practice, and it's one of those things to where, depending on what you have available to you as far as staff members and stuff like that, the insurance just, at least with a chiropractic degree, insurance just isn't going to cover a lot of the corrective. They will to a certain extent, but then you have to have that 15-minute time commitment, or you have to have the times in there, and and if you're trying to do treatments and you're trying to do a lot of modalities on top of that, once you start stacking all of these codes, then all of a sudden you're billing your insurance 5 to 7 codes, and now you have to go through a lot of hoops to figure out how you can charge a cash patient less. Not a lot of hoops, but it just adds more paperwork and headache. So I feel for the people that are in a very successful business in a chiropractic speaking or a rehab setting, and it's kind of like their hands are tied because they can't go to this model because it just doesn't make sense in their clinic. Both with the overhead or with the time commitment they need.
Yeah, it's really like we actually I don't have too many people that work for me, but I have a couple. And so we stopped really calling insurances, except every once or twice a year we'll kind of someone will approach, and so my dad is actually a dentist, and he has a couple people that he's in with the unions, and over here there's longshoremen and there's grocery store workers and stuff like that. So he's like, I have a lot of grocery store workers, can you please check their policy? I said, fine, cool, we'll call. So we called, and just from a business standpoint, this is what you're going back with. It's you just can't supply the care that you want to based upon the pay schedule. So we called, and they would agree to certain amount of treatments or visits in our clinic, but their total pay was 25 cents per day, no matter what, and we would have to recoup 25 cents? Yeah, cents. And then they said, well, you can recoup the $20 copay from the patient. And like you do 20 minutes, 30 minutes. We do the same. Some people spend 45 minutes to an hour here. Depends on what their programming is. And that is almost less than minimum wage. And it's not possible for people to get the care they need if we're dependent upon what insurance pays. I mean,
it is.
So it's really tough. So I'm envious of you because you're 100%.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of I have my clinic in Clarksville, and I also do part-time down here in Nashville out of a gym called Nashville Strength Company, and they get it from a standpoint of having, they see it as value of having me in there, because anytime I'm with one of their clients, the coach that coaches that client is also in on the assessment. So that's the model that I really like. I don't have time to train everybody. I don't have time to do that, but I do have time to give that patient some homework and show them the responsibility of, here's what you need to be able to do so you can have success in this gym. And trainer, here's what they need to be doing and not doing until they can do X, Y, and Z, and then you can let them loose and let them do whatever they want to do. and that I believe is the future, more so than the DC-MD model where you're talking about having kind of inpatient care chiropractic in the context of a hospital or a medical facility. Just because and again, we're going back to what we talked about at the very beginning with, I just kind of do what I feel like I can explain and just makes sense to me and what I like doing. Mm-hmm. And that passive care model, because there's so much skill with everything once you are really all the time, from breathing to walking to exercise, there's so much skill involved with that you can't, whatever progress you make when you're relaxed down onto a table getting something done on you, that progress you make, whether it's soft tissue work or adjusting, it's if we don't fix that system and allow that new mobility to be stabilized and used in a coordinated fashion, it's just not gonna work. And regardless of how great technology becomes, it just doesn't seem like it's a viable option. At least that's what it makes sense in my head. So I know there's a lot of people making lots more money than I am on the other model. So
yeah, well,
you can't really fault them for that.
People like to get pampered, I think too. And I don't bash the passive therapy. I call it. Yeah. So I call it a 75-25 rule. Like, I'm okay with them doing 25% of their passive care, whatever it is. But 75% of the time, do some work. Do what get your body moving, make it work better. Yeah. So
well, I use a lot of analogies in what I do and nutrition, and so to be fair and to be to kind of have some empathy with those people that want the passive therapy. Look, I understand that organic, grass-fed, free-range chickens and grass-fed beef, and I know what's good for me nutritionally, but I don't stick to that all the time, and I like to go out and have pizza. So from a standpoint of my utopian view of what I want you to do, you got to match the treatment with the personality of the patient more so than the condition of the patient. So if you know that person or that patient isn't going to do anything outside the clinic, then you better have a lot of passive therapy for them. Mm-hmm. Because that passive therapy, there's chiropractic and just everything, and whatever style of chiropractic you're talking about, or whatever style of physical therapy, or whatever style of massage, everyone has success stories of people that have failed this kind of care for all this time, and their life was terrible until they came in and got that adjustment or that dry needling or that massage or whatever it might be, and then they were healed. And there's also stories of people that have smoked until they're 110 years old and been fine. So it's like, well, that doesn't, just because it works doesn't mean it's a good approach in general. But I do say all the time, and that's why I have a consultation with every single patient before I see them in my clinic, and I talk to them. Let's make sure that you understand and have an understanding of you're not going to get better by not doing what I need you to do. And if you don't feel like you're going to be able to do it, you don't have time to do it, you don't have the resources to do it, whether that's a legitimate excuse or not, you're not going to do it. So you should probably go to this practitioner, and I'll send them to a traditional chiropractor, or I'll send them to a massage therapist that's going to that I feel like is going to be able to help them. But I don't want to risk my reputation and my style of treatment on somebody getting better by the passive portion of what I do, because when you're in a style of practice like you are and like I am, one sec, speaking of the devil, when you're in a style of practice like that, it demands that the patient takes responsibility, and not everyone's going to do that, and not everyone's going to eat organic, and not everyone's going to do all this great stuff that we know we should do for our health. And it's just a matter of matching what they need to what they're willing to do.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's I call it having the tough conversation. Like, I don't like doing it, but if someone is not going and doing the stuff that is asked of them, but also they're not reaping the reward, then I feel like we got to have an adult conversation about it, and not just like shrug it off. So, and it's awkward and weird, and I don't personally like it, but I think that's in their best interest,
Well, and I think that also comes from trying as a practitioner, staying in your lane and surrounding yourself with other people that do things outside of your lane. So that patient, it's not like you're turning them away and saying, look, you're either in or you're out. But it's, here's what we're going to do, and if you don't think this is right for you, then here's a couple other people that you can go see, and being able to network. And I've sent more people to traditional chiropractors in 6 months of my practice when I opened it up than I did in 3 years in my other practice, because it seemed like we were just taking everybody depending on what you had. And in order for me to have that word of mouth necessary to build my practice, I needed people out there saying, yes, it was great because I did this, instead of, no, I went there and he had me put a broomstick on my back and squat and then left after I did a little bit of soft tissue work and nothing changed. It's like, that's a communication issue on my part then. And there was a few of those until I decided, look, I'm just going to have to, as hard as it is as a new business to kind of turn somebody away, it was better for them and better in the long run for me to be able to get them to the right doctor at the right time.
Here, pause right there for 1 second, okay? Well, cool. I think thanks for coming on, man. Like, how can everyone reach you? Do you have anything on online that people can look at or download or content or so on?
Yeah. I'm on Facebook and I'm on Instagram and I'm on YouTube as ChiroStrength. You can find me with that. The website's chirostrength.com. And right now I do have an ebook that I've put together, like 44 corrective exercise videos, focused mostly on hips and shoulder. And then I'm trying to get some other stuff in place right now that are all going to be kind of downloadable PDF type stuff that you can get on my website. That's the whole idea, is trying to educate people and let them feel like they're in control of their own health, as opposed to just blindly allowing them to outsource their health to someone else.
Yeah, I think that's good. I really do think the way you're doing it is going to be the way of the future. You got to empower the patient. You got to educate them and get them to do some work.
Yeah, it helps everybody, on whether it's the insurance company spending less money, or whether it's the patient spending less money in the long run, or you actually being able to charge what you're worth. Everyone wins.
You don't want 25 cents?
Man, I love hot and ready pizzas. I love them, but I think I've had my fill of that and Taco Bell. So I think 25 cents is a little outside my pay grade.
Yeah, probably. Anything that you think we skipped that you want to add before we close here?
Not necessarily. I hope this makes sense to people. And if you have any other questions, you can always, I check my email like I check text. So you can always get a hold of me at drdunaway@chirostrength.com. And I think that whether you're a patient, go and have these conversations. Don't be afraid to ask your clinicians questions. And as a clinician, don't underestimate what your patient knows and where they've been. And I think that if you can help them help themselves, if nothing else, just have some resources for them to go to and look into. I think that's what I hope people take away from this, and I hope people start doing a little more of.
Nice. Perfect. A good way to close it.